Tonight's story is about a man who called for help while he was watching his own rescue arrive. His truck was found on a silent stretch of Texas highway. The deputy pulled up. The headlights swept the empty field, and his brother heard him whisper into the phone, "Run from that cop." The problem was no one could see him, not in the road, not in the truck, not in the field. Just his voice, close enough to be nearby, and then gone. Kyle Lawson would remember the road the way you remember a bad smell. Not the way it looked, because in the dark, West Texas highways all look like the same ribbon of nothing, but the way it felt. A strip of asphalt where the night seemed to press down harder, where your headlights didn't so much illuminate as admit how empty everything was. He was standing in the gravel shoulder beside a silver Ford F-150, his own car idling across the lanes with his wife and their little boy inside, and he had his phone jammed against his ear like he could force sense into the call through pressure alone. "Brandon," he said, trying to keep his voice level. "Where are you?" On the other end, his brother sounded close enough to taste. Breathing hard, words clipped, like he was trying not to be heard. "I'm right here," Brandon said. Kyle stared straight out into the fields. There was nowhere. Just flat grass and low brush and a few scattered, stunted trees that looked like they'd given up trying to become anything bigger. No buildings, no fences close enough to hide behind. No ditch deep enough to swallow a grown man. Nothing but the quiet and the wind. "You're not," Kyle said, and he hated how sharp it came out. "Your truck's here. You're not here." Brandon didn't answer that. Instead, he said, suddenly urgent, "Run. Run from that cop." Kyle turned his head, and a pair of headlights crested the rise behind him, growing larger with that slow, inevitable approach that makes your chest tighten even when you've done nothing wrong. The patrol car rolled closer, the beams washing over Kyle's boots, over the chrome of Brandon's bumper, over the emptiness beside the truck, like the light was searching for a body that should have been there. And the strangest part, the part Kyle would never be able to file away, was that Brandon had to be watching it happen. He had to be close enough to see those headlights, close enough to know exactly what was pulling up, close enough to tell Kyle to run. But Kyle still couldn't see him. And then, as the deputy's tires hissed on the gravel shoulder and the door opened, Brandon's call went dead. 2 hours earlier, though it didn't feel like the same night anymore, Kyle had been asleep in San Angelo with his own small life tucked around him. The familiar weight of his wife's breathing, the faint hum of the house, the soft, unbothered sleep of a 4-year-old down the hall. The phone ring ripped through it like a siren. He fumbled for the screen, squinting, already irritated before he even saw the name. "Brandon?" Kyle sat up, blinked himself awake, and answered with the tired impatience of a man who had been trained by repetition. "Yeah?" He didn't even get hello out. "I need help," Brandon said fast. Too fast. The words came with that panicked edge Kyle had learned to recognize the way you recognize weather, by the smell of the air. Kyle's throat tightened. "What's going on?" "I'm on 277, Brandon said. "North. I'm out here and I'm running out of gas and there's 3 guys. They're chasing me." Kyle closed his eyes. It wasn't that he didn't believe his brother could be in trouble. Brandon was the kind of man trouble found the way water finds cracks. But Kyle also knew Brandon's patterns, knew the old history that sat behind their family like a bruise nobody wanted to press. Brandon had been fighting a battle with drugs for a long time. For stretches, he'd clawed himself clean and acted like the man he wanted to be. A father of four, a partner, an oil field worker putting in brutal hours, coming home exhausted. Trying to build something that wouldn't collapse, and then sometimes that battle would slip. Quietly at first, then all at once. And when it slipped, Brandon's reality would bend. 2 days earlier, Brandon had called him with that careful tone that pretended it wasn't asking for what it was asking. Kyle had tried to talk him down, tried to make him remember the progress, the kids, the life he kept swearing he wanted. Kyle hadn't handed him anything. No number, no lead, no permission. But Kyle also knew you didn't need permission to fall if you'd already decided you were going to. So when Brandon said, "3 guys are chasing me," Kyle's first thought wasn't attackers. It was hallucinations. "Brandon," Kyle said, "what are you doing out there?" "I told you," Brandon snapped. "I'm on the road. I'm out of gas. I need you to come. Bring me gas. Quiet, okay? Like, don't call anybody. Don't tell anybody where you're going. Just come." Kyle rubbed his face hard with his hand. His eyes burned with sleep. "Why would I—" He stopped himself, forced the question into something calmer. "Where exactly are you?" 277, Brandon said again, like that answered everything. "Between San Angelo and Bronte. I'm trying to get out. They're gaining on me." Kyle listened to his brother's voice, how it darted and clipped, how it refused to settle into a normal rhythm, and felt anger begin to rise under the fear. Not righteous anger, not dramatic anger, just the exhausted kind, the anger of being pulled into a fire. You didn't start at 12:30 in the morning when your kid has school and you have work and you are so tired of this. "Are you high?" Kyle asked finally. "No," Brandon said immediately. Too immediately. "No, man. I'm not. I swear. I swear to God." Kyle stared into the dark of his bedroom and pictured his brother alone on that long, empty highway, the wide West Texas night around him like an ocean. The idea of Brandon out there, even if he was high, made Kyle's stomach twist. "You said you're out of gas," Kyle said. "You pulled over?" "Yeah," Brandon said. "But I can't stay. I can't stay because they're—" His breath hitched. "They're right there." Kyle was quiet for a beat, trying to decide what mattered more, being right or getting his brother home alive. He didn't want to indulge whatever story Brandon's mind was building, but he also didn't want to hang up and wake up to a call that Brandon had wandered off into the dark and never come back. "Okay," Kyle said, hearing his own voice go flat with resignation. "Okay, I'm coming." Brandon exhaled like Kyle had just saved him. "Hurry." Kyle got out of bed, pulled on jeans and a shirt, and tried to do it quietly, but his wife still stirred. She sat up, hair tangled, eyes narrowed. "What's wrong?" Kyle didn't want to say it. Saying it made it heavier, made it real. "It's Brandon," he said. He's on the highway. Says he needs gas." She didn't ask why. She didn't ask for details. The tension in her face said she already had them. "You're not going alone," she said. Kyle opened his mouth to argue, then stopped, because arguing would only waste time. They loaded into the car. Their son, half awake, blinked at the movement and asked a sleepy, confused question that neither adult fully answered. Kyle's wife buckled him in. Kyle grabbed a fuel container. And then they drove out of San Angelo into the night. Highway 277 at that hour felt like a road no one was meant to be on. The 2 lanes cut through open country where the dark had room to spread out, and the air beyond the headlights seemed endless and indifferent. Kyle kept scanning ahead for the glint of metal, the shape of a truck, the flash of hazard lights. Nothing. Brandon called again, and again, and again. Each time Kyle answered, Brandon sounded more frantic, and the story kept changing shape without ever becoming clear. 1 minute, it was 3 men. Another minute, it was a car behind him. Another minute, it was the woods, though there weren't woods out there the way people meant woods when they said it. Just pockets of brush and trees that looked too small to hide anything bigger than a dog. Kyle tried to calm him down. "Stay by your truck," he said. "I'm coming. I'm almost there." Brandon's voice broke into something panicked and thin. No, I can't stay by it. I can't." "Where are you right now?" Kyle demanded. "I'm right here," Brandon said, as if Kyle should be able to see him through the phone. Kyle tightened his grip on the steering wheel until his knuckles hurt. After almost 45 minutes, he finally saw it. A truck angled half on the shoulder, half too close to the lane. No headlights, no interior glow, just the dark shape of it against the darker land. Brandon's truck. Kyle pulled over on the opposite side and parked his car. He told his wife to stay inside with their son. Then he crossed the road, his boots crunching gravel, his eyes locked on the cab. He expected to see Brandon hunched over the wheel, eyes wide, maybe laughing at his own fear, maybe angry, maybe ashamed. The cab was empty. Kyle walked around the truck, peering through windows, checking the bed, checking the ground like Brandon might be crouched behind a tire. Nothing. His irritation spiked into something sharper. "Brandon!" He called into the night, and his own voice sounded wrong out there, too small, swallowed by the open land. And then his phone rang again. "Brandon." Kyle answered, furious now. "Where the hell are you?" "I'm right here," Brandon said. Kyle spun in a slow circle, scanning the fields. The darkness seemed to stare back, unblinking. "No, you're not," Kyle hissed. "I'm at your truck. You're not here." The moment stretched. The two brothers locked in that absurd, terrifying gap between what one man could see and what the other man insisted was true. And then Kyle saw headlights. A patrol car coming up Highway 277. Kyle's body reacted before his mind did. He felt the jolt of fear, the primal kind that makes you suddenly aware of your own heartbeat. He wasn't scared of the police, not for himself, but he knew Brandon was. Brandon had an active arrest warrant, the kind of thing that turns a simple traffic stop into a disaster if you panic. And Brandon was already panicking. "Run away from that cop," Brandon said, voice low and urgent. Kyle stared into the black land beside the road, trying to locate the source of that voice, not through the phone, but physically. Because Brandon had to be watching. Brandon had to be close. But Kyle still couldn't see him. The patrol car slowed and pulled in behind the truck, tires popping gravel. A deputy stepped out, flashlight in hand. Kyle ended the call, shoved the phone into his pocket, and tried to put himself together as the light swept over him. The deputy introduced himself as part of the Coke County Sheriff's Office. Later accounts would name Chief Deputy Brandon Neal as the responding officer that night, a detail that felt almost cruel in its coincidence. A trucker, the deputy explained, had called 911 about a vehicle sitting in a dangerous position on the road. The deputy asked if the truck was Kyle's. Kyle swallowed. "No, that's my brother's." "Where is he?" Kyle felt the choice settle onto him like a weight. Tell the truth and risk Brandon getting arrested. Or lie and risk something worse. Kyle said, forcing the words out with practiced casualness. "He ran out of gas. He called me. I think he walked to get some." The deputy looked into the cab with his flashlight, looked at the dark road, looked out into the fields as if he expected a man to suddenly rise from the grass. "All right," the deputy said. "You can drive up the road if you want. See if you spot him?" Kyle nodded too quickly and walked back to his car. Inside, his wife watched him with tight eyes. Their son's face was crumpled with fatigue, beginning to tip into crying. Kyle slid into the driver's seat and pulled back onto the highway. He drove just far enough that the patrol car's lights were no longer visible in his rearview mirror, then pulled over again and started calling Brandon. Again and again, the way you press an elevator button even though you know it won't make it come faster. No answer. Kyle's anger turned into a sick kind of helplessness. The highway stretched in both directions, and the field beside him looked like an empty ocean. Eventually, his son began to cry in earnest, small, relentless sobs that filled the car and made Kyle's wife close her eyes in exhausted frustration. Kyle stared out at the dark land and felt something settle into his chest. The sense that whatever was happening out there had already moved beyond him. "He's an adult," Kyle said finally, the words tasting bitter. "I came. I tried." He turned the car around. As they drove back past the spot, the truck was still there. The deputy's patrol car was still there. Hazard lights would later be turned on. Later still, the truck would be towed. But Brandon was still nowhere. Kyle went home, dragging the night behind him like a net full of unanswered questions. Morning didn't make it clearer. It never does, not with things like this. Morning only makes the fear sharper because now there's light enough to see the world continuing, as if nothing has happened. Brandon didn't arrive at his father's house. He didn't come back to Ledessa. He didn't answer calls. Ledessa Lawson, Brandon's partner of 10 years, the mother figure, in the life he kept trying to stabilize, told investigators they'd argued late on August 8th and that Brandon left the house just before midnight. The argument itself, people would say later, didn't matter in the way outsiders wanted it to matter. It wasn't a cinematic blow-up with a single line that explained everything. It was the familiar kind of fight that happens when you've been carrying too much stress for too long. Suspicion, exhaustion, old resentments flaring, the fear of relapse lurking behind every odd behavior. Brandon was 26. He worked oil fields. He had 4 children. The life around him wasn't small, it was heavy. And whatever happened after he pulled off on Highway 277 happened fast enough that by dawn, the only solid thing anyone could point to was a truck sitting at an angle on the side of an empty road. Investigators organized searches around that stretch of highway near Bronte. Family and friends searched. Dogs were brought in. People walked the fields and the brush as if the ground might suddenly give up its secret if enough feet passed over it. Nothing. Then, days into the disappearance, after the initial assumptions had begun to harden into something like a working theory, Ledessa did what frightened people do now when the physical world refuses to give answers. She went into the digital one, phone logs, call records, timestamps, and there it was, tucked among the calls to Kyle and Kyle's wife, a call Brandon made at 12:50 a.m. to 911. That detail hit like a crack in glass, because Brandon did not call the police unless the world had become unbearable. At the time, Brandon had an active arrest warrant. He had every reason to avoid contact with law enforcement. So why would he dial 911? And why, if he dialed 911, did the case initially move forward as if only a passing trucker had called about a stranded vehicle? The answer, as bizarre as it sounds, was part of what made this story lodge in people's minds. Brandon's 911 call reportedly rang through to a local nursing home in Robert Lee, Texas, because the dispatch system in that area was small and oddly routed. A man fighting for help in the middle of a field, calling 911, only to land in a place meant for the elderly and the dying. When investigators got the recording, it didn't sound like a simple, "I ran out of gas." It sounded like a man whose mind was racing ahead of his body, whose sentences were collapsing under pressure. He told the responder he was in the middle of a field. He mentioned running into someone. Accidentally, he said. He said he needed the cops. And then there was the other detail, the one people would rewind and argue over in living rooms and forums and late-night headphones. A second voice, faint in the background, too unclear to identify, surfacing near the end before the call cut out. It was enough to change the shape of the mystery. A man can vanish for 1,000 reasons. He can run, he can hide, he can get lost, he can make a terrible decision and then keep making them until there's no path back. But a second voice in the background of a 911 call does something to the imagination. It makes you picture someone standing just out of sight. It makes you picture Brandon looking over his shoulder in the dark, hearing footsteps in the grass, hearing the approach of a car, seeing something that makes him stop talking. It makes you picture why he would tell Kyle, run from that cop as if the deputy wasn't the help Brandon had just asked for. And it raises the ugliest question of all. Was Brandon afraid of the police? Or was he afraid of what would happen if the police arrived and found him before someone else did? In the months that followed, the searches widened and then narrowed again. Leads came in and dissolved. The highway remained indifferent, under sun and under stars. Brandon's case drifted into that category that keeps families awake for years. A missing person file, full of activity and emptiness, full of motion and no conclusion. Online, the story grew its own shadow life. People argued about what they heard in the call. Some claimed they could decipher words others couldn't. Some insisted the second voice wasn't a person at all, just radio, just wind, just distortion. Some were certain Brandon had been hunted. Some were certain Brandon had been high and terrified of phantoms. Some believed he'd fled because he couldn't face the consequences of the warrant, and the relapse, and the argument, and the life he'd broken again. And all the while, the strangest physical detail stayed fixed like a nail in the story. Brandon's truck had been right there. The last clean, undeniable marker. The point everyone could return to. The place where his brother stood and looked into an open field and could not see the man who claimed he was right here. That is where the mystery lived. Not in a far-off wilderness, not in a deep forest. In a place that looked, to the naked eye, too empty to hide anything. For years, the land held its silence. And then, almost 9 years later, people went back out there again. Not because the case had been solved, not because law enforcement suddenly produced a new piece of evidence, but because families don't stop searching just because time passes, and because volunteers, strangers with boots and water jugs and a stubborn refusal to let a name fade, kept returning to that same stretch near the last known location. In early February 2022, a search effort located clothing believed to be Brandon's near where he vanished, and Texas Rangers later recovered human remains in the area. For a moment, it seemed like the story might finally become simple, might finally become the kind of tragedy you can grieve cleanly, because at least you know where the body is, at least you know the shape of the end. But even the answer had its own cruel delay. DNA confirmation took time. Years. And when the confirmation finally came, announced publicly by the family in late 2024, the cause of death was still unclear, which means the story didn't end so much as it shifted into a different kind of question. Because if Brandon's remains were near his last known location, then the haunting part isn't merely that he died out there. It's that for years, through searches, through dogs, through people combing land that looked too open to miss a grown man, Brandon remained, in some essential way, unfound. As if the night he disappeared had folded itself around him and kept him. As if the simplest explanation, the one that says he wandered off and succumbed to the elements, or collapsed unseen, still isn't enough to answer the details that cling to the story like burrs. Why did he insist he was being chased? Why did he call 911 and then minutes later refuse to be seen, telling his brother to run from the law? Who or what was the second voice in the background of that call? And what did Brandon see in that open, barren land that made him speak like a man cornered, only to vanish in a place with nowhere to hide? A tangible resolution exists now, at least in name, but the residue remains. It sits in the audio. It sits in the empty field. It sits in Kyle's memory of headlights crawling closer, a deputy stepping out, and a brother's voice on the phone saying, "I'm right here," while the night showed nothing at all. This was Midnight Horror Society, dark curiosity for sleep. Until your next midnight session, sleep well.